Young boy sells lemonade to cover father's funeral costs, and then Trump walks in and changes everything. The sun had barely risen over the small town of Willow Creek when Charlie Miller slipped out of bed, careful not to wake his little sister. Lily, at just 10 years old, he had already learned the weight of responsibility. The house was quieter now, emptier. His father's absence felt like a void that could never be filled. His mother, Susan, had been working double shifts at the local diner just to keep the lights on. But funerals were expensive, and despite her efforts, the money simply wasn't there. Charlie had overheard her talking on the phone late at night, her voice breaking as she admitted that they might have to settle for a state-funded burial. The thought of his father, James Miller, a man who had worked tirelessly as a mechanic to provide for them, being laid to rest without the dignity he deserved, made Charlie's stomach twist. That was when he decided he had to do something. Charlie sat at the small kitchen table, staring at a piece of paper where he had scribbled numbers with a dull pencil. A funeral could cost thousands of dollars. The amount was staggering, but he didn't let it crush him. His father had always taught him that hard work mattered more than anything. His eyes landed on an old lemonade recipe card stuck to the fridge. His dad used to make it every summer, pouring glasses for Charlie and Lily as they played in the backyard. It was his dad's favorite. That was it. He would sell lemonade to raise money for the funeral. Charlie ran the idea by his mom, who smiled, sadly, and cupped his face in her hands. "You have the biggest heart, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "but you don't have to carry this burden alone." "I want to, Mom," he insisted. "Dad always said we don't quit when things get hard." Susan wiped away a tear and nodded. "Okay, let's do this together." The next morning, Charlie and Lily mixed a batch of homemade lemonade using the recipe their dad had loved. They borrowed an old wooden table from the garage, decorated it with a bright yellow cloth, and painted a sign in big, hopeful letters, "Lemonade for Dad's Funeral." They set up near a busy street corner, where foot traffic was steady. The first hour was slow. A couple of neighbors stopped by, recognizing Charlie and offering their condolences. Some bought a cup and left a few extra dollars in the jar, murmuring words of encouragement, but the goal seemed impossibly far. As the day stretched on, the heat became unbearable. Charlie's t-shirt clung to his back, and Lily kept fanning herself. With the paper plate, they only sold a few more cups. Most people walked past without stopping. Some glanced at the sign and hesitated. Others just kept moving. Charlie clenched his fists. He couldn't give up. By the time afternoon rolled around, dark clouds began gathering overhead. A light drizzle fell, turning into a downpour. Charlie scrambled to cover the stand with a plastic sheet, but the wind knocked over the sign, and the rain soaked their supply of cups. Lily sniffled, her small hands clutching his sleeve. "Charlie, maybe we should go home." He looked at the sky, then at the nearly empty jar. They had made less than $20. That wouldn't even pay for flowers. Tears stung his eyes, but he shook his head. "No, Lily, we stay for Dad." As the storm raged, Charlie felt his hope slipping. He was drenched, shivering, and exhausted. His mother had called twice, begging them to come inside. But he stayed. Then something happened. A car pulled up. A middle-aged woman in a business suit ran over with an umbrella, buying 4 cups at once. Then a young father stopped, giving Charlie a $20 bill and telling him to keep the change. Word spread on social media. A few people shared pictures of a determined young boy selling lemonade in the rain to bury his father. Slowly, more cars arrived. People stopped. Some didn't even take lemonade, just stuffing money into the jar. A kind old man pressed a crisp $100 bill into Charlie's hand and whispered, "Your father would be proud." Charlie wiped his eyes and nodded. Maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. He wasn't giving up. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement as Charlie stood behind his lemonade stand. wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. Business had been slow that day. Despite his determination, the goal still felt so far away. His little sister, Lily, sat on an overturned crate beside him, absently stirring a cup of lemonade with a straw. Their mother had asked them to come home early, but Charlie refused. Every dollar counted, every cup mattered. Just as he was about to call out to a passerby, a low hum of engines filled the air. The sound grew louder, and Charlie's eyes widened as he saw a convoy of black SUVs pulling up along the curb. The vehicles were large, polished and imposing, their tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. People on the sidewalk stopped to stare. The lemonade stand suddenly felt very small compared to the presence of those massive cars. Then, the door of the first SUV opened. A familiar figure stepped out. Charlie's breath caught in his throat. It was President Donald Trump. Dressed in a crisp navy suit with his signature red tie, Trump adjusted his jacket and looked around before his eyes landed on the lemonade stand. His security team moved around him quickly, scanning the area, but the president walked forward without hesitation. Charlie could hardly believe it. He had seen Trump on TV, heard his father talk about him, but never in a million years did he think the man would be standing right in front of him. Trump approached the small table and glanced at the hand-painted sign, "Lemonade for Dad's Funeral." His expression softened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $20 bill. "I'll take a cup," he said with a warm smile. Charlie's hands shook slightly as he poured the lemonade. He wanted to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He handed Trump the cup, who took a sip and nodded approvingly. "Not bad," Trump said. "You make this yourself?" Charlie swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, sir. Me and my sister." Trump glanced at Lily, who peeked at him from behind Charlie. "Well, that's impressive," he said, then gestured toward the sign. "Tell me about this. You're raising money for your dad's funeral?" Charlie took a deep breath, suddenly feeling the weight of everything he had been carrying. "My dad, he passed away," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was a mechanic. He worked really hard for us. But funerals are expensive, and my mom, she can't afford it. So I wanted to help." Trump's expression changed. The confidence and energy he usually carried seemed to settle into something more serious, more personal. He looked at Charlie with genuine concern. "That's a tough thing for a young man to take on," he said, "but you're doing something incredible here." Charlie felt his throat tighten. He blinked back the tears threatening to spill over. I just want to give him the funeral he deserves," he admitted. "He was a good man." Trump nodded slowly, then turned to one of his aides. "How much do we have in cash?" he asked. The aide quickly pulled out a wallet and handed Trump a thick stack of bills. Trump flipped through it before setting 5 $1,000 bills on the table. "That should cover a few cups of lemonade, huh?" he said with a wink. Charlie gasped. Lily's eyes grew wide. Even the people nearby murmured in surprise. $5,000, more than they had made in weeks. Charlie's hands trembled as he stared at the money. "Sir, I don't know what to say." Trump smiled. "Well, how much more do you need?" Charlie hesitated. The funeral home had given his mother an estimate of nearly $12,000 for the service, burial, and a modest headstone. She had been heartbroken, knowing it was impossible. Charlie had hoped somehow that if they just kept selling, they could reach the goal. But it had felt like trying to climb a mountain with no end in sight. Trump seemed to read the hesitation on Charlie's face. "Tell me," he said gently. Charlie swallowed hard. "It's about 12,000, he admitted. Without missing a beat, Trump turned to his aide again. "Make the call," he said simply. "Let's cover the rest." Charlie's knees nearly buckled. "What?" Trump turned back to him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Your dad worked hard. He deserves a proper send-off. And you, young man, you're doing something extraordinary for him." He gave Charlie's shoulder a firm squeeze. "Let me take care of this." Tears welled up in Charlie's eyes. He wasn't sure how to process what had just happened. Hours of standing in the sun, days of fighting exhaustion and doubt, and now, just like that, his father's funeral was paid for. Lily suddenly rushed forward, wrapping her small arms around Trump's waist. The president let out a soft chuckle and patted her head. "Thank you," she whispered. Charlie wiped his eyes, struggling to find words. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you." Trump shook his head. "You don't need to. You've already done enough. You honored your father in the best way possible by working hard just like he did." He gestured toward the lemonade stand. "And you know what? I think he'd be real proud of you." Charlie sniffled, nodding. He believed that. Trump turned to his security team, giving them a nod before stepping back toward the SUV. As he reached the door, he glanced over his shoulder. "Keep selling that lemonade, kid," he called out with a grin. "But maybe raise your prices, $5 a cup at least." A small, breathless laugh escaped Charlie's lips. He watched as Trump climbed into the SUV and the convoy slowly pulled away. The world around him felt different. For the first time since his father passed, he didn't feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. Hope filled the air like the scent of fresh lemonade. The morning of the funeral arrived with a quiet solemnity that hung in the air like the lingering chill before dawn. The small church in Willow Creek had never looked so full. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had heard Charlie's story came together to say goodbye to James Miller, a man who had spent his life working hard to provide for his family. Thanks to Donald Trump's generosity, what once seemed impossible was now a reality, a beautiful, dignified service for a man who deserved to be honored. Susan stood by the entrance, dressed in a simple black dress, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, but today, for the first time, she wasn't burdened by the fear of how she would afford to lay her husband to rest. The weight had been lifted. Inside the church, sunlight filtered through, the stained glass windows casting soft colors on the wooden pews. At the front, James's casket was adorned with white lilies, his favorite flower. A large floral arrangement rested beside it, sent with a personal letter from Trump himself. Susan had received it the night before, and when she read the words, she broke down in tears. James Miller was a hard-working American, a man who gave everything for his family. His dedication, his love, and his values live on in his children. It was an honor to help in your time of need. May he rest in peace. It was signed in bold ink, Donald J. Trump. The sight of the flowers and the letter only reinforced what Susan already knew. They were not alone. The service began, and the pastor spoke about James's life. He wasn't a famous man, nor was he wealthy, but he had been a good man, a loving father, and a dedicated husband. That, the pastor said, made him richer than any millionaire. As Susan listened, her composure faltered. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she gripped the pew in front of her. She had spent so many sleepless nights wondering how she would give James the funeral he deserved. Now, looking around at the packed church, the love and support pouring in, she realized he had always been surrounded by wealth, the wealth of friendship, kindness, and community. Charlie sat beside her, holding Lily's small hand in his. He kept his gaze fixed on the casket, his mind replaying all the memories of his father, fixing cars in the garage, laughing over spilled lemonade in the summer, ruffling his hair before bedtime. It didn't feel real. When it was his turn to speak, Charlie hesitated before stepping up to the podium. His hands trembled slightly, but when he looked out at the sea of faces, people who cared, people who had supported him, he found the strength to speak. "My dad was the hardest working person I knew," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "He wasn't rich, but he always found a way to take care of us. And when he couldn't anymore, I thought maybe I had to do it alone." Charlie took a deep breath. "But I wasn't alone. So many people helped, and because of that, my dad is getting the funeral he deserves." He paused, looking down at the small cup of lemonade in his hand. He turned toward the casket and walked forward. "Dad loved lemonade," he said with a sad smile, "and he always told me that when life gives you lemons, you make something good out of it." Then, in one quiet motion, Charlie placed the cup of lemonade on top of the casket. A hush fell over the room. Lily sniffled beside him, clutching their mother's dress, and Susan couldn't hold back the sob that escaped her lips. A single act, a simple tribute, and yet it spoke volumes. As the funeral concluded, people approached the Millers, offering condolences, hugs, and even donations to help them get back on their feet. The story had spread far beyond their small town. News stations had picked up the story of the little boy who sold lemonade to bury his father, and the president who stepped in to help. Local business owners reached out, offering Susan a better-paying job. A mechanic shop in the next town over offered to train Charlie when he was old enough, knowing how much he wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. A stranger even started a fundraiser in James's name to help the family recover. The support was overwhelming. As they left the church and made their way to the cemetery, Charlie felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: peace. His father was being honored the way he deserved. The burden that had once felt impossible to carry had been lifted, not just by Trump's generosity, but by the kindness of so many people. Charlie looked up at his mother, who wiped away her tears and pulled him and Lily close. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no more fear about what would come next. They would be okay. As they stood by the gravesite, watching as the casket was lowered, Charlie whispered a quiet promise. "I'll make you proud, Dad, just like you always made me proud." And as he squeezed Lily's hand, feeling the warmth of his mother beside him, he knew they had found peace at last. The days following the funeral were different. The weight that had pressed so heavily on Charlie's chest had eased, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. His father was gone, but instead of being consumed by grief, Charlie found comfort in the way the world had responded to his story. People had reached out from everywhere, offering support, kind words, and opportunities that he and his family never expected. Trump's generosity had done more than just cover the funeral expenses. It had given the Millers a fresh start. The donations that poured in, the job offers for Susan, and the kindness of strangers had created a foundation for something new. One afternoon, just a week after the funeral, Susan received a call from one of Trump's advisors. "Mr. Trump wanted me to personally check in on your family," the man said. "We've made some arrangements that we think might help." Susan hesitated, unsure of what to expect. "Arrangements? As you know, he believes in hard work and making sure good people get opportunities," the advisor continued. "We found a position for you at a high-end restaurant in the city. The pay is significantly better than what you're making now, and we'd like to cover your relocation expenses if you're open to it." Susan gasped. A new job, a chance to truly provide for her children without working herself to exhaustion. It was an opportunity she never could have imagined, and that wasn't all. The advisor then turned to Charlie. "And young man, we heard you want to be a mechanic, just like your dad." Charlie nodded eagerly. "Well, there's an automotive training program nearby, and when you're old enough, you'll have a spot waiting for you." Charlie's heart swelled. It felt like the world was giving him a second chance, a way to honor his father's legacy, while also carving out his own future. That night, as the family sat together at the dinner table, eating a meal without the usual worry of unpaid bills, Susan let out a deep sigh. "Things are changing," she said softly, looking at her children. And I think, for the first time in a long time, I feel like we're going to be okay." Charlie squeezed her hand. "We will, Mom." Even though the funeral was over and the money was no longer an issue, Charlie couldn't bring himself to close his lemonade stand. He had spent so many days pouring lemonade, hoping for a miracle, and he got one, but he knew there were others who might be facing their own struggles, just as he had. So he made a decision. From that moment on, every dollar he made from selling lemonade would go toward helping others in need. Some days he donated to local families struggling to pay medical bills. Other times he bought food for the homeless shelter. The first time he handed over an envelope of cash to a single mother who had just lost her job, he realized something. Giving felt just as good as receiving. News of Charlie's mission spread. More people stopped by, not just for lemonade, but to be part of something bigger. A local supplier even donated ingredients so that every cup sold could go directly to charity. The little lemonade stand that once stood in the shadow of grief had become a symbol of hope and kindness. One afternoon, as Charlie was packing up for the day, an elderly woman approached and handed him a folded bill. "I don't need any lemonade, sweetheart," she said, her eyes kind. "I just wanted to say thank you. You remind us all that the world still has good people in it." Charlie smiled, tucking the bill into the donation jar. "My dad taught me that when life gives you lemons, you make something good out of it," he said. And that was exactly what he was doing. Time passed, and while the pain of losing James never fully went away, the Millers found peace in knowing that he had received the farewell he deserved. Susan thrived in her new job, no longer having to work endless hours just to scrape by. Lily adjusted well to their new town, making friends and laughing the way a little girl should. And Charlie grew into the kind of young man his father would have been proud of. He kept working at the lemonade stand, not because he needed the money, but because he knew that kindness had the power to change lives. His story had started with a desperate need to bury his father, but it had become something much greater, a lesson in generosity, in community, and in the unexpected ways that people show up for each other. One evening, as he stood outside their small but comfortable new home, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, he felt something deep in his heart. It was gratitude for Trump's help, for the kindness of strangers, for the chance to keep moving forward. He reached for a pitcher of lemonade and poured himself a glass. As he took a sip, he looked up at the sky and smiled. "Thanks, Dad," he whispered. Because even though his father was gone, Charlie knew his spirit lived on, not just in his memories, but in every act of kindness that had come from their hardship. And sometimes miracles happen when you least expect them.